Hi, so welcome everybody. I'm Maggie Mund. I'm the chair of the CCRA's newly constituted DEIJ committee, and this is one of our new initiatives, a series of talks on social justice issues with Hugh Taft-Morales of the Philadelphia Ethical Society. And we're just so happy to have the Ethical Society, who has been a leader in these areas, for years, as our partner on this initiative. Today is on public schools, and just want to say the purpose of these discussions is not to really problem solve, but because they can be so challenging to so many people, because there's like a perpetual problem, let's say, that never seems to get resolved. The purpose of the discussions are to provide more of a lens on what the issues are, and perhaps some more compassion, elicit some more compassion on our part when discussing these issues, and just trying to bring more understanding and a more compassionate lens to the issue that is seemingly intractable in many ways. So that's the purpose of the discussion today. Hugh will go into more about the specifics of the issues and how the group will proceed. But before we get started, I know that there were several other newsletters aside from CCRA who publicized this. And so because I am notoriously bad at counting hands quickly when I'm asking people what they think about different things or any kind of a poll, I'm just going to ask you to put in the chat, as you can, how you've found out about this. So I know there was the CCRA newsletter that went out, the Ethical Society newsletter that went out. It was in the social media Rittenhouse Neighbors, Near Neighbors, and it was also in the Church of the Holy Trinity newsletter. So if you could just write that in the chat, I would really appreciate it, because I'm just trying to find out how different people came to this discussion. So without further ado, I'm gonna let Hugh take it over for now, and then we'll proceed. Thank you very much again for coming.
Thanks, Maggie, appreciate it. Hi, everybody, glad you're here. So today's topic on education, public schools, and democracy, a little topic, right? This is gonna drag us into some policy issues, but this series, Sense in the City, is about how each of us makes sense of complicated issues and how to get more comfortable with complexity to a degree, so that we can get closer to agreeing on what makes common sense. And I'm gonna be throwing out a lot of names and books, so if you want a copy of my comments today, feel free to email me at leaderhugh at phillyethics.org. I'm just putting that in the chat right now, so you can email me for any copy of this, a hard copy of it. So public schools that we're talking about today, homelessness we're talking about on the 23rd of February, they're challenging, so that's why I asked that we try to follow guidelines for our discussion, same ones as I talked about last time. But if you weren't here, the first goal line is to increase our understanding. That's the purpose, as Maggie mentioned, to engage in more reflection than action plans. We're not here to convince each other this is what we have to do. 2, respect confidentiality. What is discussed in any group is confidential to that group as far as individual people's identity is concerned. 3, listen respectfully. 4, speak from your experience. In other words, use the I statement as you can. 5, don't dominate. 6, strive to be non-judgmental of others and of yourself. And 7, be patient, because these are complex. So can we agree by consensus to try to follow these guidelines? And if you don't mind, just indicate that by wiggling your fingers or nodding your head or doing whatever you want. I'm not counting, but I just think it's important that we affirm that. So before I jump in, I want to just thank Bonnie. Hi. Thank you. I want to thank Bonnie Eisenfeld and Barbara and Maggie and others in CCRA for contributing information to this talk today. I'm not an expert, so I'm really sharing what I've gathered as much as anything. But I do know that public education is fundamental for our country's collective experiment in democracy. And frankly, that experiment is facing challenges right now. The founders of the US knew the importance of public education. Thomas Jefferson said, an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. Franklin Roosevelt said, democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard for democracy is thus education. So my opening question is, do we as Americans really believe this? Do we commit to educating our citizens? It's not mentioned in the US Constitution, but public education is guaranteed in the Russian Constitution. Many European countries, including Norway, Finland, Sweden, Germany, and France, offer free college education to their population. In the US, many can't afford to attend post-secondary institutions, and for those who can, it can drive them into lifelong debt. So I wonder whether our democracy is currently in danger because we're not fully committed to public education. Keep in mind that public schools do more than just teach facts. They teach kids how to get along. They teach social, interpersonal, and civic skills. America's foremost educational philosopher, John Dewey, understood that schools are at their best when they teach children to cooperate on shared goals. They prepare people to be engaged and responsible citizens. Public schools allow future voters to nurture a sense of we the people in order to struggle to create a more perfect union. These are lessons that modern politics is not teaching by example, so it's even more important. But rather than fully embracing public responsibility for education, we've witnessed a corporate takeover that's documented in Diane Ravage's book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, about 10 years old. And rather than unifying our populace through schooling, we've created an educational caste system. Jonathan Kozol explains that in his book, Savage Inequalities. And oddly, while education is one of the best ways to nurture responsible citizenship and to lower crime, we seem to prefer retribution to education. While schools throughout the country slash their budgets, we are pouring resources into the prison industry. That's talked about in Burning Down the House by Neil Bernstein. And he estimates that we spend 8 times more to incarcerate a young person than we spend on their education. And for the taxpayer, that seems to ignore an old expression, pay me now or pay me later. If we just think of education as preventative, that should change our policies. So schools should be where we teach kids the difference, that difference doesn't have to breed conflict. I think without excellent public schools, the hostility between the haves and the have-nots will continue to grow. The person who founded ethical culture, Felix Adley, wrote this 100 years ago, and it's still true. He said that classes of society have become so widely separated by difference of interests and pursuits that they no longer fully understand one another. And misunderstanding is the fruitful source of hatred and dissension. He insisted that we have to invest what he called our common schools. He said that the justification of our common schools lies rather in the common feeling which they create between different classes of society. And that common feeling today is in short supply. So I think we need it more than ever. So let me get off of the generals and get into some specifics that we'll discuss about, and then I'll conclude with how we fund Pennsylvania schools. Let's first go into the challenge of establishing equity in education. And remember the distinction between equity and equality. Equality is giving everybody the same. Equity is giving everyone the opportunity to succeed in life, which can differ from student to student. Now, I admit that complete equity is a high bar, which can mean that deep inequality of backgrounds and diversity of learning capacities present difficulties. And even if all politicians agreed on our policy, we may not be able to provide all students with an opportunity to succeed. That's one reason why Chris Moore, who's the head of school at Frere on Chestnut Street, told me yesterday that Philadelphia has the most deep poverty of any major city. I hadn't heard that term. Deep poverty means that students attending Philadelphia schools experience direct or indirect trauma, like violence, abuse, neglect, at a rate higher than any major city. And that was the case before COVID and before the shutdown and before murders are setting new records in our city. So schools in the city are tasked with educating students who in some cases do not have their basic human needs met. And in some cases, school environments make the issues worse by throwing things like health hazards like asbestos that is in older buildings on top of the kids as well. But despite those challenges, I still think our goal should be educational equity. And equity is necessary for a lot of reasons, starting with the obvious fact that some communities have much greater resources available to support neighborhood schools, while others have few resources. I mean, take Greenfield Elementary School near the Ethical Society at 22nd and Chestnut. It serves a clientele that can afford to raise money for projects and programs out of reach for schools in under-resourced neighborhoods. Does it mean that Greenfield parents shouldn't raise funds? No, but few schools have well-organized support our school pages, like on their website, with community auctions and a list of supplies needed and a Venmo QR code ready for you to scan and contribute. And the parent support programs offered at Greenfield seem top rate. I mean, last night they had a positive psychology program on Zoom that I'm sure is a great benefit to Greenfield families, but that kind of program is very hard to organize at schools where more urgent problems are being addressed daily. But the issue of equity is complicated. For example, my daughter, she teaches at a diverse DC public school. She asked her parents to donate tissue boxes to their classroom, and she was flooded with supplies. And teachers in poor areas might not be able to get that support given the deep inequality of community resources. But my daughter said that the contributions help establish equity within her school. In other words, students whose parents didn't send the kids to school with tissues are given at school the same opportunity to blow their noses. So when discussing equity, I think we have to distinguish between the macro level of society-wide equity and equity within specific school communities. They don't always match, or they can run counter to each other. One idea to consider is supporting schools from more resourced neighborhoods partnering with one other school in a less well-off neighborhood. More resourced communities could share what's gathered in resource collection projects and school auctions and book drives as a sign of solidarity and commitment to equity. Equity is harder to achieve due to the declining number of teachers being trained in our country. Chris Moore told me yesterday that in 2010, there were about 21,000 teaching certificates issued in Pennsylvania. And in 2021, that number is around 6,000. Wow. 21,000 to 6,000. The reality is that teaching is hard no matter where you go, but pay is better and workload more sustainable in the suburbs. So while the city schools do have wonderful dedicated teachers, more wealthy schools in the suburb can be more attractive to many. And that was underscored by Paul Tuff, who wrote Helping Children Succeed. He documented that poorer students and students of color are likely to attend schools where the teachers are less likely to be experienced and less well-trained. They are less well-trained than teachers at other schools in general. Another challenge to equity is known as the digital divide. And this has obviously had greater impact during COVID. And it's not just about the money needed to get adequate home Wi-Fi or up-to-date hardware or software. It's about computer literacy. Parents in some homes don't have the background to support their children, and it's hard to make up for that. And so often we assume that everyone should be able to get online, but that's not the case. We have to close that digital divide. Same situation goes to the application process at specialized schools or gifted and talented programs. I mean, that process can stump just about any parent, let alone parents unfamiliar with these kinds of applications, particularly immigrant parents. And that means that some children who might be capable of flourishing in accelerated programs are missing out. And now I hear the process regarding magnet schools in Philly is changing. Hopefully that'll simplify the process, but I don't know, it may even complicate it. And things are very complicated sometimes for undocumented parents who avoid conflict with the school system because they fear that their involvement will lead to potential deportation. And given the rising anti-immigrant attitudes, that's not an unreasonable fear. My daughter actually helps coach parents of undocumented parents about what the family information they have to share and what they can keep private. For example, you don't have to say what is the language that is spoken at home. Many parents think they have, and if they say Spanish, they worry that they're going to get singled out. Extracurriculars is often where schools in communities with more resources most outpace schools from less resourced communities. There are some nonprofits like Philadelphia Futures that offer supplementary courses in SAT prep to low-income college-bound students. Other nonprofits offer a variety of after-school programs in writing, drama, chess, Scrabble. These programs actually give students important mentoring opportunities and safe spaces after school that can really change the life trajectory. Some extracurriculars are why kids go to school. They so look forward to those. So I just urge you to encourage others to support Philadelphia Futures or other similar organizations. Another issue that comes up again and again and again in this conversation is charter schools. 6,700 charter schools in the United States educate about 3 million students. And they are always praised by a wide variety of politicians. That generally gets them votes. And a lot of public charter schools are well managed with excellent teachers and administration. And there are statistics that show that. But statistics also show that some schools are not well regulated and may not be good use of taxpayer dollars. This is often a polarized conversation. But it's complex because some claim that racism affects how charter schools are judged, that there's a racial insensitivity on the part of evaluators that biases their republic. In other words, that some charter schools are being more harshly evaluated. So I think we just have to be very careful in drawing conclusions. I think we need to look more carefully there. But there are charter schools who close down in the middle of the school year due to mismanagement, some of it criminal. One CEO of a Philadelphia charter school pled guilty to embezzling $80,000 of school funding. And according to Philadelphia Magazine, over the past decade, administrators have pled guilty to fraud, misuse of funds, obstruction of justice. You probably remember when about 5 years ago, the Pennsylvania state auditor said on multiple occasions, quote, Pennsylvania has the worst charter school law in the United States. Governor Wolf is trying to address that situation. I hope he does it with care and sensitivity. At the very least, charter schools have chipped away at resources that might be available to mainstream public schools. And not just funding, but charter schools, especially those that are fronted by celebrities, often siphon off a large percentage of strong students, which in the end can hurt the functioning and the reputation of mainstream public schools. I'm just beginning now to understand how this is part of the controversy involving Meek Mill, Kevin Hart, Michael Rubin. I'm sure some of you understand this better than I do. A huge issue making headlines nationally, obviously, is how much parents or politicians who claim to speak for parents should control what students learn. There are efforts to block the teaching about the realities of racism or to ban books about the Holocaust, like Maus. And those are threatening academic freedom and integrity. And to resist those who want to keep developmentally appropriate information away from students, I urge you or your friends to run for the school board, show up for school board meetings, or join the local PTA to get your voice heard. And I'll add that many families preparing to start for the school year for their children have a hard time handling the pros and cons of specific schools and figuring out where to send their schools. There's a great tool Bonnie mentioned to me, the Philadelphia School Partnership, a nonprofit that was written about by Bonnie in the CCRA newsletter that rates schools. You can visit their database at a Travis is putting that link in the chat, Great Philly Schools. There's another great service that they have, but not all parents can do it. They can't figure out how to get their child to attend anything other than their neighborhood school. But PSP does address that in part with city grants in poorer areas. And you can learn more about that at the link phillyschoolpartnership.org. One other idea to help under-resourced students is to let them know about some support groups that can help them, including JEVS Human Services, which I can send you if you email me. They offer GED training and vocational and technical training. Beyond Literacy is a group that offers GED and English as a second language. The Community College of Philadelphia offers remedial high school courses and prep for college and career training. And Youth Build Philly is a charter school ages 18, 21 dropouts that offer high school students vocational training. If the school doesn't have a way to help parents connect with those groups, people can volunteer to help families do that. And there are a lot of specific issues that are of concern that I can't talk about, like a lot of parents find it very difficult to navigate gender fluidity in their school. That's a discussion that is alive. And there are groups like in Texas trying to ban discussing LGBTQ issues. And it may not be long before those are coming before us in Pennsylvania. And like the rest of the country, there's all these debates about teaching all of history and not hiding away racism or anti-Semitism or sexism or homophobia. And then, of course, the issue of teachers' unions is a discussion area. But I want to end today with what I think is the biggest issue that's alive right now in Pennsylvania, and that's our antiquated funding system for public schools. On the most basic level, most of you know that schools in poorer areas do not get adequate state funding. Often states help address this inequality, but in the Commonwealth, only about 34% of funding is from the state, which severely limits what states can do. And this is a battle that many, including Power Interfaith, have been fighting for years. David Masankis did much of the research for Power that explained the situation here in Pennsylvania, and you can see a report that is available through a Power Interfaith link that Travis will put in the chat and is in my notes. One ethical member on the call today, Nick Sanders, knows this much better than me, and Nick can correct me later if I'm wrong, but I think the main problem Mosenkis points out is that Pennsylvania created a formula meant to address equity in school funding, but the law passed to implement it applies the funding formula to only 9% of this year's school budget. And as a result, and I'll quote Mosenkis here, it guarantees that the school districts will continue to have huge inequities in their state funding levels, including systemic racial bias. The extent to which districts get more or less than their fair share of state funding correlates strongly with the percentage of their students who are white. On average, the whitest district gets thousands of dollars more than their fair share for each student, while the least white districts get thousands less for each student than their fair share. End quote. Now, the Pennsylvania Constitution states that the General Assembly must, quote, provide a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. The state is currently being sued in Commonwealth Court by a number of school districts that claim that Pennsylvania methods of public funding of education is so inequitable and insufficient that it violates that clause. 2 weeks ago, on January 26th, plaintiffs rested their case. The Public Interest Law Center is active in the case, and there's a good summary of it that you can get at another link on the publicinterestlaw.org website that I'll put in the chat. And last week, I attended a Zoom update of the case with Deborah Gordon-Clare, the Executive Director of the Education Law Center that's working around the clock on this case. I'm not sure how the case will conclude. Last I heard, the state was offering their arguments. So that's a lot on the table. And we're going to break in a moment for small group discussions. I urge you to remember the agreements about sharing time and participating to understand and so on. But if you wish, there's so much there, so I'll let the leaders of each group decide how they discuss for 20 minutes a couple of these issues, but I'll offer you two scenarios or two questions to consider in your group, and I'll put these in the chat. Suppose you're in a conversation with a friend who complains that the public school system is a waste of money and that education should be completely privatized on a fee-for-service basis. What do you say? Second, a friend asks you to donate to a fundraiser of a school in an economically advantaged area. Do you? So I'm just throwing those in the chat as ways to stir the discussion, and I'll turn it back to Travis. So we'll break for our small groups for 20 minutes, and then we'll be back together in the main room. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I'm going to just reheat my coffee. Cold coffee is.
Hey, Travis.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
We are back.
All back.
Oh.
Hugh will be right with us. He stepped away for about a minute or so.
Yeah. Less than that. Less than that.
Less than that. Never mind.
When you only have a little coffee, it doesn't take long to warm it up. So. I hope discussions were fun. All the groups are back.